they were a persecuted group, which you would think had the opposite effect. You would think that if a persecuted group would be driven down into the, into the caves and driven away from society, but rather the unusual nature of the Christian community, as seen by historians of their time and later writers, really set Christians and the Christian community apart from other groups, other nominal groups. So what you tend to have is, if you looked at Christians from the outside, they were an unusual group who gathered together. In the face of death, they stood and held their faith, and they shared that faith in common, and that gave them strength to continue to fight that fight. So even as they are being taken to the Colosseums to be eaten by lions, they pray, and they pray for the people that are beating them and hurting them and spitting at them and calling them names. And what we tend to see there is that the world around them does not really understand them. However, slowly, one by one, throughout their encounters, they convert people, not necessarily with the promise of a luxury in this world, as we sort of see in current Christian circles, but rather a promise of a crown given to them in heaven. Because for them, the coming of the Messiah was immediate. He was not coming in like 1,000 years. He was coming today. And they had to be prepared for that. And so that drive to be prepared, to be found worthy when he comes, was something that motivated them tremendously. As you all know, the early church met in catacombs, in areas where other people would not necessarily gather. Later on, this leads to even our strong attachments with the departed in our own worship, where we commemorate and we venerate the bones and the relics of saints as part of our worship. In fact, you'll find even in the Eastern Church, they go as far as to say that any altar that is built has to have the relics of the saints placed within its posts. And there's a big ceremony that goes along with that. We don't have that extension. In fact, many will attest that we have interesting things that use as relics these days. But that whole concept of our connection with the departed, especially, can come out of the fact that the early Christian communities met in catacombs, and they celebrated Qur'ana, on the tombs and tombstones of their departed, and they considered those people to be martyrs, and that was more or less inspiring for them and motivating for them, and they began to grow. However, as we all know, the church, as it spread out, and there are always the tales and the legends of where the disciples went and who they encountered and their stories, the stories of the church, that the only saint who was not martyred, only apostle who was not martyred was, anybody? John, right? He died exiled on the island of Patmos. So in the stories of these saints, they go to these places that they are not familiar. Of course, given the supernatural powers granted by the Holy Spirit to be able to speak to these people, the courage to face the challenges in these various places. We have our tales that St. Thomas, of course, was sent to India. And in the beginning, the way that the story goes is that he's not very happy that he was called to go there. He tries to get out of it. Jesus meets him in the marketplace, has an appearance to him and gives him courage to get ready to go. And the hagiography of St. Thomas has all of these very unusual stories about how he finally went, and there are the various legends that take place once he does arrive in Kerala. I'm not the authority on the legends and stories and myths of St. Thomas. I will leave that for more educated people to discuss. But the important thing is that those stories come out of a community that finds itself deeply attached to the need to be attached to Christ, right? They need that connection through St. Thomas. And we have stories of, sightings of St. Thomas Christian communities from people who are not Indian, from people who are outside of that Indian context. And there are some, of course, sources that are wishy-washy, as in all things historical, right? But there are other historical stories that have sort of stood the test of time, and even against questioning and challenges, they've sort of held their own. Needless to say, the current church in India is, our current church in India is, of course, Orthodox by all means. It is accepted as such for the most part among its peers. And that continuity is something that any church, any apostolic church longs for. So you can understand why sometimes they look backwards and sort of make ties that may or may not exist, because they feel the need to ground themselves so that people cannot question their authenticity. And it makes sense, right? And it happens here as well. When we have our churches, none of our churches here are from the 1st century. We don't have direct historical ties to Christ or his apostles. But we'd like to say that when we did this church, we followed the pattern set by so-and-so church in Kerala. They do this in Parimala, so we do this here. So we'd like to make those connections to sort of authenticate our own experience and our own religious validity. So keeping those things in mind, we're going to go back and do a quick overview of early church history. Okay? Stuff that you probably learned in Sunday school, but at the time you weren't really that interested. Probably even today you're not that interested. But it's important for you to just get a basic overview of the path that the church took. And when we talk about the church, we, as much as we speak about the ideal church, which is the church that Christ instituted with his apostles, we know that through the influence of man, that this church underwent several changes and several schisms, several major divisions. And so we're going to use this chart to sort of flow through the beginning one, okay? And then, because we have the pleasure of having Thirumeni with us, when we get into Indian church history, and I try to wade through all of that, Thirumeni is going to reach down and grab me out and say, I should stop talking, I will do this, and then we will all be happy. He will give more details about the nature of Indian church history, okay? Okay, so early church. For the first 300 years of the church, it is the age of the martyrs. We know that the church spreads in small communities. We know that the Christians are openly persecuted and challenged. They are forced to worship the emperor, and many Christians do die the martyr's death. But it is important to know that there were Christians who turned the other way, and there were Christians who did fall away. But the ones who did stay, and the ones who fought till the very end, they inspired others to also take up that same yoke of faith. It is also important to know that the spread of Christianity happened at that time through 2 or 3 different ways. Number one, of course, you have merchants and travelers, right? And we know through our study of regular world history that a lot of the development of the world happens through the way that trade happens. So merchants go from port to port or from place to place, telling stories and tales of what they've seen, what they've heard, who they've encountered. So, of course, the tales of these Christians, these unusual people, who, according to early historians, they gather together to celebrate the festival of some one man, Jesus, who supposedly died and rose on the 3rd day. And it's important to know that the early historians even noted that they were noted by their unusual gift for love. Their unusual gift for being able to forgive their enemies or to proclaim their faith in Christ in the face of death, their love for this Jesus. More so, stories of how they were cannibals also began to spread. And you can sort of understand that if you keep talking about how we're going to eat the flesh and blood of, and drink the blood of one Jesus, how stories of cannibalism could spread from that. And these tales of fantastic things happening in among the early Christian communities. I mean, it is weird that they meet in catacombs and tombs, and they're eating flesh and drinking blood, and they have this unusual love and fellowship. Those type of tales spread very fast. So as this spreads through trade routes, we also know that soldiers within armies who have this very difficult job of facing death in their daily life. I mean, because it was not a stable area, right? Early Palestine, the Roman Empire is not a stable area, constant uprisings and battles and revolts. So these soldiers who every day sacrifice their lives hear stories and tales of these Christians who are showing courage in the face of danger for no reason, really, if they look at it that way. And so they are inspired, and so among the soldiers' ranks, you have secret groups of Christians who, and we study later, and now like with new archaeological finds of crosses being found in soldiers' barracks, we can sort of understand how that sort of faith spread among the soldier class of the early Roman Empire. It doesn't hurt also to have people like a St. Paul, who is a Roman citizen, stand up and say, this is my faith, this is what I defend. I mean, clearly it didn't save his life because he was also persecuted, however, gave him a lot of validity to be a Jew who was also a Roman citizen, who was taught by great teachers. You know, for him to come out and to initially be the persecutor of Christians and then to come out and to now promote this Christianity, it meant a great deal. It sort of promoted this idea and the spread of the ideas throughout the Roman Empire. We also have, of course, missionaries, right? People who travel from place to place. The most famous account of this missionary, not missionary travels, pardon me, pilgrimage traveling for people who want to go to the holy places. And they go and they spread what they saw in different places. There's a book called The Pilgrimage of Igeria, if I'm not mistaken. And in that book tells the tales of how worship is conducted in the different places that this Igeria went. Okay, these kind of stories and tales, of course, spread, right? And again, I relate it back to our time. We have those type of storytelling and spreading of ideas. If they do it in Kottayam Viriyapalli, then they do it here. If they do it in Kodamangalam Cheriyapalli, they try to do it here. If they do it in Parimala, we try to do it here. Those type of connections and those sentimentalities, the way that we tell those stories and the stories of miracles spread very quickly, and so it did throughout the early Roman Empire. Now, as it spread through the administration of the Roman Empire, you find that governors and the various people within Caesar's courts, the senators, are being influenced. You see at some point that Constantine's mother, Queen Helena, and Constantine himself are influenced by Christian teachings, and therefore Christianity at that point, after the persecutions by the Emperor Diocletian, Constantine comes in, makes Christianity an accepted religion within the Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Empire. And by doing so, you have Christians now coming into the public eye, right? And as they come into the public eye, they develop things that they were normally not able to develop. For example, actual church buildings. They no longer had to hide to worship. They could now build their own temples and have their worship openly. And then you see, of course, you know, it's like when you're asking people to hide, and you give them the opportunity finally to come out and to proclaim their faith and proclaim their way of life. I mean, you see that they go a little bit, everybody look at me, you know, look what I have, look at my glorious cross. It's not about putting secret crosses in places where people can't see, or little symbols of the Christian early church. Now it's like, look at this giant gold cross I have. I'm Christian and I'm proud about it. I'm not afraid about it. I'm not going to be persecuted. And of course, it didn't happen overnight, right? The persecution continued in pockets throughout the empire for a long time. And then later on, the Christian faith becomes the official religion of the empire, as the emperor now chooses to take that religious title for himself, as he's going to be called a Christian and tries to continue that. But even then, martyrdom is what is motivating and moving this Christian group forward. As the church continues to grow, of course, administration of this church becomes an issue. It's one thing if you have a pocket of 20 people that you're trying to control. It's another thing if you are what we call an episcopos, the overseer, and now you not only have one pocket of Christian people to watch, but you have several within a city or several within an area. And so now the authority of this episcopos is growing. Not just that. Throughout these times, it's not like Jesus walked out with his Jesus handbook. And he didn't say, listen, hi, I'm Jesus, I'm the Son of God. You'll find everything you need to know in this book about, please read it, refer to it if there are any questions. My divinity is in the first chapter, humanity is in the last few chapters. If you look about, it wasn't so easy because everything at that time was either in in manuscripts handed down from the evangelists in the first century who wrote down their accounts years after Christ's death, or epistles that were circulated among the churches, some authentic Pauline epistles, some pseudo-Pauline epistles, right? And you have to understand that if I want to get my point across, and I'm not one of the apostolic people or people with the name in the church, what do? I put a letter out with one of their names, hoping that someone's going to pick it up and read it. It happens today. It's not anything new. So at some point, the churches are getting these letters and epistles and teachings and theologies that come out of common human curiosity, wondering whether Jesus was really human or whether he was really divine, wondering whether the Holy Spirit comes from God or comes from Jesus. Maybe it doesn't come from anywhere. Maybe it is its own divine presence and spirit. Maybe we have to talk about Mary and her role in all of this. Is she like supernatural? How is she able to hold God within her body and give birth to a God? And these type of discussions took place, and of course people put out their own ideas because there was no central reference point. Well, where there is no central reference point, the church needs to gather, the leaders of the church need to gather, and they begin to gather in events called councils. And the first few councils were considered to be ecumenical councils. The first council ever was held in Jerusalem, with the apostles being the members of that council, and their disciples being members of that council, along with Paul. Does anyone know the reason why the first council was gathered? It's in the Acts of the Apostles, so it's not like I'm pulling this out of nowhere.
Was it to discuss whether Gentiles should be circumcised?
Yes, excellent. It was to discuss whether Gentiles should be circumcised, their role in the church, how they would be accepted, should they become Jewish before becoming Christian. And Paul led one argument, and who led the other argument? Okay, Peter, James, the whole Jerusalem club, right? They led the other argument. For them, what did they know about their own life? They were Hebrew, and it helped them to understand Jesus, and so they became Jesus. Jesus himself was Hebrew, so it only made sense that everyone should be Hebrew and then Christian. But Paul fought against that, and we owe St. Paul so much, because if it was not for his argument, where would we be? We would be a Judeo-Hindustani Christian sect, because we would have this mix of all these different cultures, and it would be a very difficult thing to convince people to say, listen, I need you to be Christian, but before you're Christian, I need you to be Hebrew, and I need you to be circumcised for the men, and I need you to then, after a certain amount of time, become Christian again. It doesn't work like that. Paul fought against it, and it says at the end of the council that the Holy Spirit guided their decision-making, and they came to a consensus about it. Sure, not everybody was happy about it. Rumor has it that Matthew threw a tantrum. I'm totally making that up. That was supposed to be funny. Clearly it's not. But they all came to a consensus, and it seemed fitting to the Holy Spirit that these things should be as such. So if that's the first apostolic council, later you have the first ecumenical council meet in the town of Nicaea in the year 325, okay? And does anyone know what the topic of Nicaea was? What was the main reason? Now, I have to tell you, it is very unfair to cover all of these things and really understand what's going on in an hour. And we probably have way less than that already. Way less than that, 30 minutes. So I recommend a lot of independent reading. You're adults, right? You don't need to be handed a Sunday school book. And many of you, when you have need to search other things in the world, we refer to books and we refer to the internet to do research on our own. So feel free to take time to do that. But what we're going to say is this. There are 3 ecumenical councils to which all churches hold true. Does anyone know the 3?
Constantinople,
Very good. Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus. And then these three councils, and I'll tell you the years for them. We have 325 for the Council of Nicaea. We have 341 for the Council of Constantinople, and 431 for Ephesus. Right? All right. And keep in mind, that's about 100 years where the church together, the one church together, when faced with different controversies, whether it be about the humanity or the divinity of Christ, whether it be about the title Mother of God, whether it be about the essence of the Holy Spirit, all of these different topics are things that, you know, we could sit and argue about, but what do we really know? These people get together, and when we talk about these people, we're talking about the bishops, the priests, the deacons. Everybody gets together for these synods. Today, we don't have the synod as the Episcopal Synod, right? So the bishops gather to make decisions, but, you know, the pseudo version of the larger synod would be, I guess, the association. You send all the delegates together to sit and talk, but they more or less run the administration of the church, whereas the Episcopal Synod runs the spiritual and faith and discipline matters of the church. In all of these synods, they come to a conclusion, but it is not clean by any means. It's, you know, there is the group that leaves, you know, pouting and shouting and doing their own thing, and in all of the decisions that are made, the church comes to a consensus. And the reason that this is so valid is that we believe that this gathering is inspired and governed by the Holy Spirit, that the gathering of the church in this manner is powerful, and it is binding. You know, you can't have 300 some odd people come from all over the world come to a conclusion about, you know, who Christ is or who God is, and to say, well, you know what, that's their decision, I'm going to do whatever I want. Because these people are gathered together in prayer. They're gathered together for the sake of the growth of the church. And so these three ecumenical councils are considered to be of utmost importance. And any apostolic church that calls itself such acknowledges these three. The fruit of these councils is what we have today in the Nicene Constantinople Creed that we say in our worship. Now, that's a whole other topic for us to discuss because there are variations on that creed. And so if you look towards the West in the Roman Catholic Church, you have what they call the Apostles' Creed, which is different than the Nicene Constantinople Creed. Later on, we'll find out with the Roman Catholic Church, they add to the creed, but you know, it's not like, oh, I can't believe you added to the creed. It's like that, but with other stuff. And by other stuff, I mean politics. And so for anybody who sits here and wonders that, oh, I can't believe our church has so much politics, I think this is what Dimity was sort of referring to tell you that if you want to know about church history, it can tell you a lot of things that will give you reason to leave the church. Politics has always been part of the church. Why? Because our church and our faith does not live outside the context of government and culture and the nature of people, right? Our faith and our religion, everything dwells within that context. And so because of that, there's always that problem. And you'll find, and you know, when we were in seminary learning about these things, Father John Erickson was our teacher, and you know, he's quite an animated person. And you find out some very weird things about the church and about the rule of the church and how much having power on a larger scale may have corrupted the church and the way that the church functions. I mean, especially if you look out into the Roman Catholic West and how, you know, how they come to power and Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Empire. Crazy stuff happens out there. When you have an army and when you walk around with full regalia of the emperor and you have the authority to destroy and to create, and you know, crazy things can happen. You may or may not stray from your Christian calling, and you know, we'll leave it at that. In the eastern side of it, it's not like we're doing much better. I mean, we have, and by we, I say us because we are part of the eastern part of the church, right? The word Eastern is the same as the word Oriental. The word Oriental means Easter, right? So it's like the Eastern Church and then the Eastern Church, but we're just using two different names for it. But it's not like we're doing much better. We get caught up in our own governmental issues where our bishops are placed in charge of various localities, and they're given authority over those localities. And then in order to maintain their positions of power, they're called to make allegiances with people that they were not normally associated with. And especially with the rise of Islam, when you have for the record, I'm not using this as a bad word, but as a common threat to Christianity or a common enemy of Christianity at that time, well, you make alliances that you might not be so excited to do. And so we have stories of, bishops being deposed, brought back, deposed again by another person that doesn't like them. I mean, most notably, we could probably say St. John Chrysostom, who was the patriarch of Constantinople. Him and the emperor at the time did not get along. And so every time he came up to the pulpit and he spoke out against them, they would depose him. And so he would no longer be patriarch by their terms. Then later he would leave, he'd come back, he'd be patriarch again, they'd depose him again, he'd be out and in. So you're going to see a lot of that when you look into the depths of history. Do not be afraid, O little flock, because this is the nature of the beast, right? This is who we are as people. People always think that, all the leaders of the church should be like angels and blah, 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 but we come from among all of you. So we are only going to be a limited reflection of that, angelic light, whereas the vast majority of our life experiences comes from the way that we all are. So keep that in mind when you do your own research. Do not be so shocked. I mean, be shocked, because some of the stuff is crazy. I mean, when you want to ordain somebody to the patriarch and you don't have proper authority, and you get so caught up in apostolic succession, which means that the laying on of hands is really important, and you hear stories of how they went and dug up an old patriarch who was dead and took his hand and laid him on people. I mean, this is shocking stuff. It's exciting, but take all of that with, man, we are as messed up and in need of Jesus as anybody else is. But it doesn't invalidate what Christ taught in the beginning. That's something that we need to understand. The church in its true nature has survived despite all of these things, right? Despite all the crookedness that individuals have. And it's really important for you to see it that way. For you not to say, oh, the church is corrupt. For you to sit and look at history and say, individuals were corrupt. And to say that those individuals, used, their positions or whatever for their own needs. They are not a real reflection of, what the church is supposed to be. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Anyway, moving forward. The Eastern Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox Church split at the Council of Chalcedon. And at the Council of Chalcedon, there is a question as to the nature of Christ. And without getting into too much detail about the nature of Christ argument, we're just going to say that in retrospect, the Oriental Orthodox Church and the rest of Christendom, the rest of the Christian West, were saying similar things, but using different language to say it, and thereby causing major drama, not to mention the fact that one side excommunicated people on our side, and we excommunicated people on their side. And so these type of divisions really last a long time. Even to the fact that today, with the work of people like Dr. V.C. Samuel, Father Dr. V.C. Samuel, Paulos Margregorius Didimeni, and other people to sort of bridge the gap between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, you have some pretty hardcore people on both sides who sit there and say, we'll never take those people, because for them, Saint Severios and Saint Felixenos are heretics. They've excommunicated them. And we've excommunicated saints on their side. And so these people who hold such hardcore positions are not able to open up their minds and say, look, weren't we saying the same thing? But we let politics and feelings of the time get involved in those decisions and cement that division between us. From that point forward, you have a very distinct type of church happening in the Oriental world. Just for your notes, which if you don't have already, the Oriental Orthodox churches claim membership from 6 churches. And really it's from three families of churches. You have, of course, the Armenian church. And the Armenian Orthodox Church has two families within it. Just write that down. Then you have the Egyptian, the Coptic Orthodox Church. And from them, they've later split into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church split into the Eritrean Orthodox Church. Again, hopefully you're familiar with the fact that Ethiopia had a civil war, split into two countries, right? Eritrea and Ethiopia. They all have their own church. All three churches are in wonderful relations with each other, though it may not have been that way at first. But you know, it's sort of like a model for even us to consider because of our drama in our wonderful country of India. So they have those three churches that are tied together. So you have the Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Eritrean. Then you have the Syrian church, to which we are now tied. And then we have the Malankara church. And we use the term Malankara because of its ancient roots. Malankara is the name of our region within Kerala. It's a historic region, more than the newer name of the Indian Orthodox Church, is something that we use here to sort of clarify to non-Indian people who we are. If you told them Malankara, they would not necessarily understand. But in the larger scheme of things, the term Malankara is the ancient name of our church, and it's something that we would like to keep. It's why they don't call like the Egyptian Orthodox Church, even though the word is the same. They don't use the term Egyptian Orthodox Church. They say the Coptic Orthodox Church, right? Needless to say, these are the 6 Oriental churches, split from the Christian West. And later on, you find another great schism happening in the year 1054. In 1054, you have the growth of the Roman Catholic Church, or the Western, the extreme Western Christian Church, growing as its own independent empire. You find a second empire that is based out of Constantinople growing, and constant bickering between the two. Because the Roman Empire grew so fast and so wide, it became important to have two centers of leadership. And there was the Emperor of the East, the Emperor of the West. They never really got along because they were both contending for, I guess, ultimate power, right? And if we sort of look here, we go through this original church, right? And we get to the councils, which we all can agree on. And then the Church of the East sort of splits off here, which is the Assyrian church, the Chaldean church. They're what we call Nestorians. For those of you that know about the early councils, Nestorianism was condemned as a heresy by the church, but because of its nature, that like it was, you know, it wasn't so like offensive to people, that a good part of the eastern part of the church accepted Nestorianism as the base of their faith. And so that church continues till today, even in places like Iran, Iraq, and in India, the Chaldean church still exists. In fact, that they're not even allowed in Iran. I believe that their headquarters is in Chicago, the ancient city of Chicago. They have a patriarch, and their language is East Syria, which has similarities to our own. And we'll leave that at that. So that's this strand of the Nestorian church. As we get to the Council of Chalcedon, the church splits. And of course, you know, because we are going to be Oriental Orthodox centric, we have the larger bar. And this bar that breaks off is the Church of Rome, the Church of Constantinople, pretty much based on the way that the empire is split up. And as time goes on, you know, if you study European history, the year 800 AD on Christmas is a huge day because it's the day that church and state become combined in one, where the Pope pretty much, and the term Pope just means father, because even the Coptic patriarch is called Pope. So let's not think that that's some kind of like superior term or anything. It's actually the position that was an issue. But the Pope is pretty much the pet of the emperor at this point. So the emperor says, this is what I want, the Pope makes it happen. The Pope says, this is what I want, the emperor makes it happen. They're buddy-buddies for life. And even though they're buddy-buddies, they're also trying to get one up on each other, right? Because now it's about power. They have power in the West. So in 800, Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, the first of his kind, where he is now claimed to be emperor because of the Christian God's divine choice. Does that make sense? Before, Caesar was always seen as God, right? Caesar always claimed, I am God. And so he makes his decisions as a God. But here, for the first time, you see that the Christian God is invoked as giving Charlemagne all the power and authority to do what he wants. Now, if you are one of the subjects of Charlemagne or one of his governors or whoever the different rulers are under them, you're not going to mess with him. Because you mess with him, you're really messing with God. So now you have this weird dichotomy of both church and state combined in Charlemagne. And it builds up to where now bishops are pseudo-governors, right? Now you have the development of cardinals and the different clerical orders of the church. And you also have invasions. If you have an empire, you also have enemies. And the barbarians in Europe attacking Rome, trying to take over the empire, well, they were considered to be the heathens, right? They have no God, they believe in animal spirits. And so now you invoke religion as a motivating means to strike down barbarians. So the barbarians win in between. I mean, they do get Rome, they sack major cities within the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. But essentially, when Rome is backed into a corner, Rome picks up the bat phone, calls Constantinople, and says, hey, Justinian, buddy old pal, I need some help. Can you send an army? Justinian's like, oh, the connection's not clear. I can't really hear you. Click. He doesn't send anyone to help because it's in his benefit to watch Rome fall, because then he becomes sole emperor, right? I mean, you guys are understanding this on a historical level, right? Take yourself out of the religion part of it for a second. And so when Rome gets sacked by the barbarians and they feel like they're surrounded and not helped by anything, all they have left is the church and the pockets of the church. You learn in European history that Rome, as the center of the Catholic Church, moves from Rome to France, resets up its headquarters in Gaul, the other term for France, and builds from there for a long time. Well, what happens when Islam grows? And Islam grows, and it's not like Islam's going door to door with pamphlets, they're going door to door with the sword. And through violence, there's a lot of conversion that takes place in the Middle East. People are being killed, both Jews as well as Christians in different types of churches and faith beliefs. They're being killed by the Muslims. So Justinian picks up the phone and calls his buddy on the western side. And he's like, oh yeah, you remember this? Click. And he doesn't send anyone to help Constantinople. This tension between the two lead to the major issues, okay? In 1054, the Pope of Rome excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople over a local issue called the Filioque cause, which was basically that in the Nicene Creed in the church in the far, far west, we're talking about in Spain, in that church they, for the sake of defending and strengthening the role and the power of the Holy Spirit and the authority of the Holy Spirit against people who taught otherwise, they inserted the phrase, in the Nicene Creed, and we believe in the one living Holy Spirit, who proceeds from the Father, and who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified. That's our version of, that's the church's version of the Nicene Creed. However, in the far, far west, I keep thinking of Shrek, far, far away there. Anyway, in the far, far west, they inserted, and we believe, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, and who with the Father and the Son is worshipped. So that phrase, and the Son, the Latin word is filioque. And so that phrase created such torment and pain for all the Christian faithful that the churches of the East rose up and said, what you're doing is absolutely wrong. And really, let's be serious. It's a theological issue that really is not all that crazy. It's not that far of a stretch. However, because it was done unilaterally, the rest of the church had major issues. Besides the fact that of the 5 apostolic sees, that Rome was becoming so strong really rubbed people the wrong way. Really bothered the other patriarchs that Rome which everyone agreed was the first among equals, because they were all equals, they were all considered to be patriarchs, heads of their church, but when they gathered together for sake of order, Rome would be first. Then later on, Constantinople would be given the next seat in honor because it was considered to be the second Rome. Then, of course, you have all the other seats, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Is the order correct? And Jerusalem being the last one. Jerusalem being given a seat only because that's the land where Jesus lived. Okay, so keep all of that in mind. Antioch and Alexandria become
the also as a seat of honor. They don't have jurisdiction.
Yes, yes. There's no real authority there, right? Because it's like sort of, I mean, if you know your geography, Jerusalem's sandwiched between the region of Antioch and the region of Alexandria, in which, by the way, are two major schools of thought, growth, development. The church fathers grow up in these schools of thoughts. The people that we commemorate in the fifth diptych are developed and brought up within these contexts. Moving forward, this schism happens because they use this filioque cause. They use all this political tension between the two sides. And you know what, they pretty much had it. They're like, you know what, you want to do this, you're out. The other guy says, you know what, you're out. And the stories of how they do it is quite interesting as well. I mean, when the Pope sends his delegates to Constantinople to excommunicate them, you know, there's liturgy going on, and the representatives walk up in the middle of service during liturgy. They have the bull, they leave it on the altar during the middle of service, and they leave. I mean, it's pretty dramatic. I mean, but from understanding church history, that's sort of the way that they did things, right? Everything was dramatic. Everything was over the top because it was about getting the point across. It was about establishing your dominion. So, 1054, Rome and Constantinople excommunicate each other. Rome develops as its own church independently, and Constantinople continues to grow independently. Okay? Any questions up to this point? Great, moving right along. In 1453, Constantinople is sacked by the Islamic groups, and it is destroyed, and the head of the church then has to disperse from there. The Eastern Orthodox Church grows within its own cultural context in different areas. You have patriarchs and Catholici all in different places and developing their own churches within their own language. We're not going to get into the details of the Eastern Orthodox Church today. And we're not going to go into any more of the Roman Catholic Church, except to say that the Roman Catholic Church grew, like waxed and waned with power, depending on how successful they were in defending their borders and how unsuccessful they were defending their borders. At some point, they became so powerful that their own theology began to be influenced by their power. So for things like the forgiveness of sins, which is, in our understanding of it, you know, Christ has commanded his apostles that whosoever you forgive, their sins shall be forgiven. Very simple. There's no real menu. There's no real, like, you know, ratio as to how many sins per forgiveness or how much money per sin or anything like that. But later in the Catholic West, you see that they're selling what they call indulgences, saying, okay, you know what, you had to kill 10 people. This is what we're going to do. Why don't you give me your house deed and some money and a donation to this church, and those sins will be forgiven. We can write your name in the book of life. We have such authority. Abuses of power. And how widespread that was, I mean, I'd probably have to do a little bit more research on that, but things like that. And also the re-emergence of simony. Does anyone know what simony is? Simony is the selling of offices. So it's like, Joe's like, you know what, I grew my beard and my hair out, I really want to be an Achin. And I say, Achin, these days, that goes for 25 grand at least. But no one has to see that. You can just make an offering and we'll take care of it. That's simony, selling of office. It's actually one of the first things that the apostles say is absolutely wrong, and you are forever, like, you know, shunned by God and blah, blah, blah for doing it. Because in the Acts of the Apostles, there's a man named Simon Magus who sells offices and says that he has the Spirit of God. Read Acts of the Apostles, read it. And so simony begins to grow in the church. Corruption begins to grow in the church. You also need to understand that the whole concept of unmarried priests, celibates in the Western church also take place once the church grows in power. Mainly because if your churches are becoming the seats of power, right? And if your priests are married, and your priests are having children, and their children are boys, well, in that time you can understand that the concept of apprenticeship was very strong, right? So if you were a blacksmith, your son was a blacksmith, his son was a blacksmith. You owned the blacksmith shop in that place. The same thing was true of priests. If you were a priest, your son was a priest, his son was a priest. So the church stayed within a family line. But what happens when these churches are now in charge of a larger area? They have actual authority, they have income coming in. Hey, the whole empire is at war. We need money. Oh, ushering at this local church, can you give us money for our, to support and defend you? Sorry, can't happen. But you have 2 rooms full of gold. No, we can't really do it. This is for our church and blah, blah, blah. The bishop had very little control over his churches because churches were family churches. So what ends up happening is, how do you prevent families from going on? Well, you prevent them from having children. And then for them, they use the guise of, and I mean, this is my opinion, don't use this as like official church history, but put 2 and 2 together, it still equals 4. You tell your priest that they can no longer get married, they have to be celibate so they can devote their lives to the church, which is a great thing, by the way. We're not, they're being celibate, they're doing a great job. Like all in all, like these things are for political.
10 minutes.
Great. At this point, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to say that. So anyway, long story short, that in order to procure the churches, put them under the direct rule of the bishops within the given areas, and not turn them from family churches to, episcopal churches. You have that sort of system put in place, and that lasts till today. I mean, if you look at the Orthodox Church, we don't have that same system. So think about all those things. Now, we got to talk about the church in India. We got 10 minutes. You ready? Let's do this. The church in India, okay, as per our stories go, and I'm going to do as much reading as possible. And then at some point, when we get to about the 17th century, I'm going to tag that with me. Okay? All right, so according to our traditions, AD 52, St. Thomas arrives in India, and he is martyred shortly after. Evidence of the church in India is seen randomly throughout various historical notes. In AD 189, the philosopher Pantanaeus, he visits India, and he says that there's a Christian group there who reads the Bible in Hebrew. Now, it is not a foregone conclusion that there was a Jewish community in Kerala at the time, because even in the port of Cochin, you have synagogues that are still there today, and you have a Jewish community that still existed. So it's not a crazy idea to think that there could have been a Christian community that branched out of that group there. We have references to the local rulers granting rights to Christians, and those rights were marked on copper plates, which I guess was the iPad of the time, and they would write it on copper plates, present it before the people. Christians were held in great esteem at that time. They were given certain privileges that other people were not given. I think it's fair to also say that within the caste system, that they were considered to be very high up. We've read passages where an unclean person could become clean simply by bringing the unclean person to a Christian and having the Christian place his hand upon him. So that was the regard of Christians within the Indian culture at the time. We also have, in 345, Thomas of Cana coming to Kodalur. Did I say that right? That is that accurate? And later we have different references to the church in India in writings from people who were in Persia and in the Middle East. For the attendance at the Council of Nicaea, there is one Bishop John of Persia and India who attends that council. We also have St. Gregory the theologian later on making mention of how St. Thomas was the apostle for India. We also have to understand that what we consider India today may not have been what was considered India then. So when we say that St. Thomas landed in Kerala, in those specific places, we don't know for sure, but we can be pretty sure that he definitely reached North India, to which St. Matthew also has claim, and there are communities within Pakistan and Afghanistan that early Christian communities that have claim to St. Matthew being their the apostle who brought the gospel to them. After the 4th century, we have the Persian Nestorian era, where our church has ties with that church and its bishops and members. And I'm going to leave it at that because I can't pronounce half of their names anyway. So we have about 1,000 years of relationship with the Persian church, to the point that even today people will say, oh, isn't your church the Nestorian church? The remnants of that church in Kerala is the Chaldean church, the Assyrian church that still exists in Kerala. In 1290, Marco Polo, he arrives in India. He begins the Western invasion of our wonderful country. In 1498, Vasco da Gama comes, and thus begins the Portuguese invasion of Kerala. Now, as the Portuguese come, and something that the Roman Catholic Church generally does is it likes to maintain its order, right? It's, basically, they need to tell everyone that they encounter that the Pope is the church, he's the head of the church. Everyone who's not under the Pope is not really under a real church. Everyone needs to come under that jurisdiction. They come to India, find this Christian community, and they tell them that, well, you're not really part of the church because you're not under the Pope. And they begin to spread that idea, and they're very, what's the word, aggressive about their means, that even in the face of this presence being there, other churches would send people to help us, send bishops to help us, and they would like attack them and arrest them and hide them away and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, he's laughing, that means it's probably not good. In 1599, the Synod of Diemper, Archbishop Alexio de Menezes. And so, basically, he brings the Church of India under the Pope of Rome and says that all the churches there should be under him. But the people are not necessarily so excited about this. In 1653 is the Kunin Cross Oath at Mattancherry Church. Basically, it is a gathering of the faithful, and I guess it started with people holding onto the cross and swearing that the church in India would never be under the authority of anyone outside of India. And it was called the Kunin Cross because they tied a rope so that everyone could hold onto it, and they pulled it or tilted or... Okay. In 1653, Martham I was elevated to the role of the first bishop in India by 12 priest elders, and that succession continued. So you have Martham I, the second, the third, etc., for a while. And throughout this time, you have the Catholic Church establishing itself. In 1663, the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church is formed, and it is actually the majority of the parishes in Kerala or in India at the time that they fell under the control of the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. The remnant that remained was upheld by the ties to the Syrian Church, because we have in 1665 the Metropolitan of Jerusalem that we mentioned before, Mar Gregorios. He comes to Kerala to help preserve their faith, but he didn't stay for long, right? He arrived and then he got sick, and then he passed away in Kodamangalam, where he was...
No, that's a different...
Is that the different Gregorios?
This is Parod.
Oh, right. And his influence there was strong enough just to preserve the church, to give them that sense of, you don't have to be influenced by the Catholic Church. And so, I'm going to turn it over to Theory. Can you just give us the brief, I think what people want to know here is, when did the Martham Church start, or when did this church start? So this is where my area of expertise.
How much do I have? 2 minutes?
You have 2 minutes, right? As long as you need. Actually, you know what? They have a 15-minute break, so we can run a little bit into the break. So it's all you.
Okay, I'm very poor with dates, so don't ask me the dates. It's with the British coming into the scene. That's when the Portuguese was initially ousted from the Indian scene by the Dutch. So that brings in the Protestant idea to India. And Dutch had only a very short period of control in India. And then they were overtaken by the British. And British, fortunately, they had a sort of secular policy. British imperial policy was never get messed up with the local religious policies. But then the British had some political problems. Then one of the residents, that is the name of the office they used to represent the British interest in the royal court. So one of the residents writes to the British head office, it was still East India Company, not the formal, the British part of the British Empire. So he writes back to his corporate headquarters, it may be a good idea if we can get the Christians, who are an influential group in Travancore, under our belt, suggesting to them that, oh, it's better for you to be under a Christian king rather than with the Hindu rulers. So they brings in the whole idea of you come under Christian kings. And they bring in Protestant missionaries that is something called the CMS Mission of Help. So they say that they help us. They did some good things. That's how they help us establish the seminary. They brought in English education that sort of helped us to get into the modern ideas. Along with that, they brought in their own theological ideas. And some of the priests or one of the teachers of the seminary got influenced by that. I'm getting this short abbreviated version. Abraham Malpan was influenced by that. He comes under the whole Anglican idea of sola scriptura, everything should be according to the scriptures. And then the bishop said, okay, if that is the case, I'm not going to ordain the people you teach. So he sends his nephew to Antioch. And that's how Mathews Athanasius was consecrated as the metropolitan. And interestingly, he was only a deacon when he was sent there. He was a very smart person. He was brilliant. Of course, his professors write really bad things about his character. We don't want to go into that. He studied the Scottish Missionary College in Madras. So they had very bad remarks about his unworthiness to be a clergy. But besides that, he was very brilliant. So he was sent to Antioch, and he was consecrated by Metropolitan by telling the patriarch that he is a priest while he was only a deacon. And because patriarch somehow got the list from India saying that these people are under discipline, he said, are you Deacon Matthew? No, I'm not Deacon Matthew, I'm Pastor Matthews. So he was consecrated by Patriarch Elias II, and he came back, and that is the beginning of the Marthoma Church. And of course now they claim that, oh, we left the church without any dispute, but we went into a long litigation with the Marthoma Church. So finally they had to hand over the properties, including Padai Seminary was the seat of the Marthoma Metropolitan for some time. So finally the Royal Court of Travancore issued that order saying that, no, all this belong to the Malagara Church, you don't have any right over that. So that is precisely the history of the Marthoma Church. Then we continued, and then we still continue with the struggle with the Church of Antioch, with its own political ramifications. Should I go within 2 minutes?
Sure.
So now I think it may be better if you have some questions, I can answer that rather than, because you can't expect me to do a church history 3-hour credit course on like 2 minutes.
Where is the split with the Portuguese church?
Technically we are not still split. There are multiple phases of it. Because the one split was 1912, not 1912, right? When Vattaceri was excommunicated. Then we had a reunion in 58. Then the present split took place in 70s. So,
I mean, the reason that Devani says that technically we're not split is because the court has already said
there's only one church in
India. There's only one Malankara Orthodox Church in India.
Well, haven't split us when they had only in their first meeting.
It's till 19. See, till Bhattacharya Tirumeni, that's I think it was consecrated in 1905 or something. Two of them were consecrated together. Bhattacharya Tirumeni and Kochura Yuris Athanasius Tirumeni. So, but when the conflict with the Patriarch came, Athanasius Tirumeni, was it Athanasius or Bouldos? He took the side with the Patriarch. So, even there, the split was, they were consecrated together, then they took the different. So, it's a chronologically, you cannot put a predate time on when it happened. And even both of them were consecrated by the Patriarch.